future in-laws mocking a high school-educated mother in Mandarin, at a family dinner treating her with utter disdain. But the moment world languages flowed from the mother's lips, revealing she understood everything, the tables turned. An unimaginably cruel and elegant judgment was about to begin. As Sarah Lim pushed open the heavy glass doors, she felt drawn into a completely different world. The interior of the upscale Peranakan restaurant before her was more than just a dining space. It was a meticulously crafted work of art, a stage that visibly showcased an invisible social hierarchy. The air subtly infused with the aroma of ginger flower and spices, the thick silk carpets that swallowed every footstep, and the renowned Peranakan art pieces adorning each wall silently declared that this was no ordinary establishment. Sarah self-consciously adjusted her outfit. The elegant yet pricey branded dress, bought with a significant splurge from a high-end boutique, felt like a common pebble on the street amidst the restaurant's opulent ambiance. Her mother, Madame Tan Mei Ling, standing beside her, looked even more out of place. Her mother was dressed in a simple, loose-fitting batik print dress, seemingly hand-picked from a local fabric store. No elaborate jewelry, just a modest jade pin securing her neatly coiled hair. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yet there was no trace of nervousness on her mother's face. Instead, a sense of calm radiated from her as she curiously observed the unfamiliar surroundings. This very calmness made Sarah even more anxious. They were led to a private room named the Orchid Room. As the door opened, the gazes of two women already seated within pierced Sarah and her mother like sharp arrows. At first glance, Mrs. Serene Chua, Alex Wong's mother, exuded an air of depth and intimidation that was anything but ordinary. She wore a pearl necklace with a subtle sheen, and intricately crafted rings glittered on her fingers, catching the light with every elegant gesture. Despite her former profession as a secondary school English teacher, she looked more like the wife of a CEO of a large corporation. Next to her sat a younger version of Mrs. Chua, so strikingly similar that one might easily mistake her for the same person. This was Miss Cheryl Chua, Alex's older sister and the successful principal of a renowned tuition center. She was adorned from head to toe in the latest designer fashion, looking like a walking advertisement. Her eyes, like an overt scanner, swept over Sarah's and Madame Tan's outfits, handbags, and shoes, instantly assessing their presumed value. "Oh, you're here. Traffic must have been terrible, Mrs." Chua's voice was honeyed, yet a subtle thorn lurked within. They were barely 5 minutes past the appointed time, but her tone suggested they had delayed by an hour. Sarah's face stiffened slightly, but Alex, sitting beside her, quickly stepped in to ease the tension. "Mom, Cheryl, this is my girlfriend, Sarah, and Sarah's mother." He turned to them. "Please greet them." Alex was a dependable and kind-hearted man. Sarah had fallen for this very quality and decided to marry him, but at this particular moment, his kindness felt almost helpless. He seemed oblivious to the chilling atmosphere his family was creating, or perhaps he was deliberately ignoring it. "Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Sarah Lim." "I'm Tan Mei Ling." 10:11. Following Sarah's strained greeting, her mother offered a calm introduction. "You must have had quite a journey to get here." "Mrs." Chua merely gave a slight nod without rising from her seat. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Madame Tan's modest batik dress and unadorned face, then losing interest drifted towards the window. Cheryl took it a step further. Without even looking up from her smartphone, she gave a perfunctory greeting. "Yes, please sit." A palpable tension like a taut string filled the air. Far from a pleasant engagement dinner, it felt more like a one-sided interview or an inspection. Dishes began to arrive one by one. It was a lavish spread fit for royalty, but to Sarah, it tasted like sand. Mrs. Chua, with a cultured demeanor, led the conversation, adding explanations about the food. However, the cutting edge of her words was subtly directed at Madame Tan. "Sarah, you have such a radiant complexion. You must take after your mother. Madame Tan, you must have been quite a beauty in your youth. You've maintained yourself so well." 10:11. It sounded like a compliment, but the word maintained carried a subtle contempt, as if marveling at skin that hadn't been touched by expensive cosmetics or dermatological treatments. Madame Tan merely offered a faint smile. "I don't do anything special for maintenance. I simply live life as it comes, following nature's course." "Oh, really? That's quite unusual these days." I, for one, feel uneasy if I don't visit the dermatologist twice a week. Cheryl feels the same. Women, after all, must cultivate themselves throughout their lives. Wouldn't you agree? Mrs. Chua looked at Madame Tan seeking affirmation, but Madame Tan quietly raised her teacup and took a sip instead of replying. Did that silence bother Mrs. Chua? Her questions became more persistent and pointed. By the way, Madame Tan, where are you originally from? Your accent is almost imperceptible. I'm a true Singaporean. Ah, I see. So you must have attended all your schools in Singapore as well. Finally, the inevitable question arrived. Sarah's heart sank. She instinctively knew that all the long, tedious small talk had been a prelude to this very question. She wanted to interject to somehow change the subject on her mother's behalf, but her mother was a step ahead of her. And with not a hint of hesitation, she answered very calmly, I only completed high school. The air in the orchid room instantly froze. Even the faint background music that had been playing seemed to cease. The expressions that bloomed on Mrs. Chua's and Cheryl's faces were not merely surprise. It was the look of long-held suspicion finally turning into certainty, a sneer mixed with arrogance and contempt, as if to say, I knew it. Mrs. Chua loudly placed her chopsticks down. Her honeyed smile vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp mask of disdain. Cheryl openly scoffed and turned her head away. In that brief moment, Sarah felt her blood run cold. A surge of self-reproach for failing to protect her mother and an unbearable rage at their arrogance welled up within her. Her mother's expression remained serene. She calmly looked at the food before her as if her academic background held no meaning to them whatsoever. That composure only fueled their arrogance further. Mrs. Chua exchanged a meaningful glance with her daughter Cheryl sitting beside her. Then, as if Madame Tan and Sarah were not present, they began to converse in a language only they understood, Mandarin Chinese. 12. It was a cruel and insulting language, uttered with the certainty that Madame Tan and perhaps even Sarah would not understand. In that moment, the opulent room with its gilded carvings transformed into a cold prison trapping Madame Tan and Sarah. And their jailers were these two women. The instant Mrs. Chua uttered the first Mandarin word, the air in the room grew even colder. She deliberately spoke slowly and with exaggerated intonation, as if to flaunt her Mandarin proficiency, while simultaneously displaying intellectual superiority to the supposedly ignorant beings before her. So everything makes sense now, doesn't it? Cheryl immediately echoed with a contemptuous laugh. Of course. I thought something was off. A high school graduate. In this day and age, honestly, their conversation was unrestrained. They seemed to have completely forgotten that Madame Tan Mei Ling was sitting directly in front of them. No, it wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional disregard. To them, Madame Tan was no longer a conversational partner. She was merely an object to be analyzed, evaluated, and scorned. Sarah didn't understand Mandarin perfectly, but the words high school graduate Gaozhong Wenping, Gaozong Wenping, along with their expressions and sneering tones, were more than enough for her to grasp the gist of the conversation. Her face flushed crimson with rage and humiliation, feeling her blood rush backwards through her veins. She wanted to jump up and throw a teacup at their faces. Alex, what are you doing? Apologize to my mother, Sarah whispered, clutching Alex's arm. But Alex was helpless, fidgeting nervously. His face pale, he alternated glances between his mother and sister and Sarah and Madame Tan. His lips trembled a few times, but no words came out in the end. He was always powerless in the face of his mother's and sister's unyielding and authoritative demeanor. Never had that helplessness felt so resentful. Sarah's desperate gaze turned to her mother. Madame Tan sat motionless. Her expression was enigmatic, as if the Mandarin conversation had nothing to do with her, like a distant story from another land. There was no anger, no sorrow, no embarrassment. She was as serene and calm as a bottomless lake. Where did such tranquility come from? Was she too ignorant to feel insulted, or had she reached a state of transcendence? Sarah was confused. Mrs. Chua's venomous remarks grew increasingly harsh. Like the former English teacher she was, she used her entire vocabulary to ridicule Madame Tan's supposed ignorance. Think about the children's education. How can a woman with such limited schooling contribute to their intellectual development? She'll probably just hold them back. Cheryl took it a step further, bringing up practical concerns. It's not just about education. It's about class. How are we supposed to introduce her to our social circle? Everyone will laugh at us. This marriage would stain our family's reputation. In their conversation, Madame Tan was referred to as her or that woman. She was treated as an invisible person, not even worthy of being called by name. They dissected and ridiculed every aspect: Madame Tan's humble attire, her silent demeanor, even her simple way of eating, using them as material for their mockery. They were filled with an arrogance, as if they alone monopolized all intellect and refinement in the world. Sarah could no longer bear it. Tears welled up to her chin. She abruptly stood up. "Stop it. What are you doing in front of my mother?" At Sarah's outburst, Mrs. Chua and Cheryl paused their conversation, momentarily startled. But their expressions showed no apology or embarrassment. Instead, they displayed displeasure, as if to say, "How dare you, Mrs." Chua elegantly dabbed her mouth with a napkin and said coldly, "Sarah, please sit down. It's not appropriate to interrupt adults' conversations." Her tone implied that Sarah, unable to understand Mandarin, was making a fuss over a misunderstanding. Stunned by their brazenness, Sarah was speechless. It was at that very moment Madame Tan Mei-ling, who had remained silent until now, quietly spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was firm and clear enough to silence all other noise in the room. "It's all right, Sarah. Calm down." Madame Tan looked at Sarah and said softly. Then she slowly turned her head and directly faced Mrs. Chua and Cheryl. A smile still graced her face, but it was a smile utterly different from the gentle one she had worn moments before. It was a cool, sharp smile, as if she saw right through everything. Madame Tan paused to take a breath. A suffocating silence filled the room. Mrs. Chua and Cheryl's faces clearly showed their dismay at Madame Tan's unexpected reaction. They had expected Madame Tan, like a simple, subservient village woman, to merely bow her head and endure their insults. But Madame Tan's gaze completely defied their expectations. Her eyes held something deep and unyielding, something they could not possibly fathom. It was time to remove the mask and step onto the stage. Madame Tan quietly placed her teacup down. The gentle clink of the cup against the saucer resonated in the room like a signal announcing the prelude to a coming storm. Madame Tan first looked directly at Mrs. Chua. Her gaze was no longer that of a simple country mother. It was the gaze of a seasoned negotiator, honed through countless diplomatic tables, exchanging sharp diplomatic rhetoric, dissecting opponents' intentions, and exploiting their weaknesses. It seems Madame Chua is very concerned about children's intellectual development. The words that flowed from Madame Tan's lips were in perfect, fluent standard English. Her pronunciation and intonation were precise, like that of a news anchor, with no hint of any regional accent. Mrs. Chua and Cheryl were momentarily taken aback. This was not the rough, uncultured speech they had anticipated. Madame Tan continued. Her voice was calm, but each word carried an icy weight. "My highest academic qualification, a high school diploma, must seem utterly insufficient by your standards, Madame Chua. That is why in my presence, confident that I would not understand you discussed in Mandarin how my daughter's educational background would harm the children and how my social standing would tarnish your family's reputation. Is that correct?" Mrs. Chua's and Cheryl's faces turned ashen. They were aghast that Madame Tan had accurately summarized their private conversation, and in English no less. Their minds were filled with confusion. How did this woman understand Mandarin? No, it couldn't be. She must have just overheard a few words and made assumptions. Mrs. Chua tried to compose herself, her dry lips parting. "Madame Tan, I don't know what misunderstanding you have. We were simply discussing educational perspectives regarding Alex's future." Her voice trembled slightly. Madame Tan lightly dismissed the disingenuous excuse. Her gaze now shifted to Cheryl. "And Miss Cheryl." From Madame Tan's lips flowed French. 12. It was not the clumsy level learned in elective class. It was smooth, natural pronunciation with elegant and precise grammar like a native speaker. Education does not guarantee class, nor does wealth prove nobility. Your contempt for others merely reveals the poverty of your own spirit. Cheryl's face went blank as if she had been slapped. French. She ran advanced conversation courses at her tuition center, but she had never heard French spoken with such fluency. The sentence Madame Tan uttered transcended mere language. It carried a sharp philosophical admonition. Chided directly for her arrogance and snobbery, she could offer no retort. Now Madame Tan's final gaze returned to Mrs. Chua. This time, she switched languages again. It was concise and powerful Mandarin Chinese. 12. Her tones and pronunciation were flawless, honed through fierce negotiations with Chinese delegations on numerous diplomatic stages, leaving no room for error. It is natural for any parent to wish for their child to soar like a dragon. However, judging people by their outward appearance often leads to great mistakes. It is utterly arrogant for you to judge my life by your own standards. What do you truly know about me? 3 languages: English, French, Mandarin, Chinese. Each message delivered in a different tongue aimed precisely at one target: their narrow-minded and arrogant sense of superiority. The room was enveloped in complete silence. Sarah stared at her mother, mouth agape. She couldn't believe this was her mother. Her mother, who had always been quiet and gentle, who had lived a simple life haggling over bean sprouts at the market. Sarah had never dreamed such a side was hidden within her. Something hot welled up in her chest. It was beyond surprise and shock. It was a profound sense of pride and awe. Alex, too, was speechless. He stared at Madame Tan with a completely bewildered expression. He was gripped by guilt over his mother's and sister's rudeness, and simultaneously by awe at the incredible scene unfolding before his eyes. The situation had completely reversed. The mockers had become the judged. Mrs. Chua and Cheryl trembled with extreme shame, as if they stood naked in the middle of a public square. The fortress of intellect and refinement they had spent their lives building had crumbled helplessly before 3 languages spoken by a woman they had dismissed as a mere high school graduate. Mrs. Chua's pride as a former English teacher shattered into 1,000 pieces. She realized painfully how narrow-minded she had been in the face of Madame Tan's perfect linguistic abilities. Cheryl felt as if her snobbery was being shredded by the elegant whip of French. Madame Tan quietly rose from her seat. She no longer needed to offer them any explanations or apologies. Everything was already settled. Sarah, let's go. Madame Tan took her daughter's hand, and without a moment's hesitation, she opened the door to the orchid room, leaving the 2 women frozen in shock and dismay behind. Just before the door closed, Madame Tan left them with one final remark. It was not in any foreign language, but in the most common and simple English. The meal was fine. We'll take care of the bill. As for you 2, it seems you need to study your languages a bit more. The world isn't just about English, after all. 12. Those words were the final dagger to their hearts. It was not mere insult. It was the most elegant and cruel revenge, refuting their entire lives filled with intellectual vanity. As they walked out of the restaurant, Sarah couldn't say a word. Led by her mother's hand, her mind felt as though a massive storm had swept through it. What had just happened in the orchid room was too surreal to believe. Her mother's fluent foreign languages, the frozen faces of her prospective mother-in-law and sister-in-law, and that chilling final remark, every scene replayed in her mind in slow motion. When they got into her mother's humble, aging local car parked in the basement, Sarah finally gasped for the breath she had been holding. The faint scent of her mother's usual lavender air freshener permeated the car. It was only after smelling that familiar scent that a sense of reality slowly returned. Mum. Sarah spoke with difficulty, her voice thick. What on earth happened? You knew French and Mandarin Chinese, and you understood all the English they were speaking. Madame Tan silently started the car, and slowly she drove out of the parking lot. Silence hung in the air for a while. The luxurious restaurant's lights receded into the distance outside the window. It felt as though they were leaving a false world they had briefly inhabited, returning to true reality. It was only when the car entered the main road that Madame Tan spoke. Her voice had returned to its former gentle and calm tone. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Sorry for what, Mum? I'm so incredibly shocked right now. I don't know if this is a dream or reality. Sarah's voice trembled with excitement. She was confused, yet overwhelmed by a powerful emotion rising from deep within her chest. It wasn't resentment towards her mother. It was closer to the awe of someone confronting a great secret. Madame Tan smiled faintly. In that smile was a mixture of reminiscence and relief about a story kept hidden for many years. Where should I begin? Ah, yes. I should start with the story of my maternal grandfather. Madame Tan's story began with her impoverished childhood, a period Sarah vaguely knew about. A desperately poor family, a sick father, and a determined mother who struggled to keep the household afloat. And amidst it all, young Tan Mei Ling, who found her only escape in books. I loved studying, my dear. It felt like all the knowledge in the world was contained within those old books. I had a particular talent for foreign languages. Even though we had no money for tuition, I memorized entire old phrase books I found in secondhand shops and learned pronunciation by listening to radio broadcasts from the military base. Her voice was calm, but it was imbued with the aching thirst and passion for learning. I wanted to go to university. My dream was to become a diplomat. I used to imagine myself communicating with people from different countries with different ideas in their own languages and working for my nation. But our family circumstances meant I had to support my younger siblings, and I eventually had to give up on university. Sarah's heart ached. She knew her mother hadn't gone to university simply because they were poor, but she hadn't realized the depth of the dream that lay within. Even after graduating from high school and working in a factory, I never stopped studying. I worked during the day and lived at the library at night. By the time my siblings were all settled and our parents had passed away, I was already well past 30. That's when I thought, before it's too late, I'll challenge my dream one more time. Madame Tan quit her factory job and, with the money she had saved over several years, moved into a small, humble room in an old shop house in Singapore to prepare for the Public Service Division PSD Foreign Service Officer exam. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Everyone around her said it was madness. They said it would be harder for a high school graduate woman in her 30s to pass the Foreign Service Officer exam than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And then I passed, Madame Tan said it nonchalantly as if she were simply talking about buying tofu from a local supermarket. But Sarah could feel the tens of thousands of hours of desperate effort and tears hidden in that one sentence. That's when I found out I was pregnant with you. Your father was a colleague I met during my training, but his family's opposition was too strong. They said an orphan, a high school graduate like me, wasn't on their social level. In the end, we parted ways, and I decided to raise you alone. It was the first time Sarah heard about her father. She was shocked, but this was not the time to question it. A more important story awaited. Even after joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MFA, my educational background always followed me like a label. I had no choice but to prove myself through my abilities. I took on difficult postings in conflict zones that others avoided. That's how I naturally picked up various languages. French was from African conflict zones, and Mandarin Chinese was from East Asian negotiation tables. Those were the languages I learned to survive. Now all the pieces fell into place. Her mother's humble attire, her frugal lifestyle, and her seemingly detached attitude towards worldly affairs, it wasn't ignorance or indifference. It was the composure of someone who had weathered countless storms, let go of everything, and come to grasp the essence of life. Currently, I work at the MFA headquarters. My role would be something like an international economic dispute resolution negotiator, chief negotiating representative, an MFA negotiator. Sarah couldn't close her mouth. The image of her mother trimming vegetables at the market and preparing simple meals in their old HDB flat simply wouldn't connect with the image of a negotiator, fluent in multiple languages, mediating international disputes. Why did you never tell me? Sarah asked. Madame Tan pulled the car over to the side of the road. She turned her head and looked deeply into her daughter's eyes. I wanted you to grow up normally. I didn't want you to receive unnecessary attention or become arrogant because of your mother's profession or background. I wanted you to stand in the world as yourself, through your own efforts and abilities. And today, I had no choice. I could tolerate anything else, but I couldn't bear them insulting me in front of my daughter. A faint mist gathered in her mother's eyes. At that moment, Sarah threw her arms around her mother. Her mother's small, frail shoulders trembled slightly. How much pain and sorrow had she endured alone all these years? Sarah wept silently for a long time. They were not tears of sadness. They were hot tears mixed with apology, gratitude, and an inexpressible sense of respect. Just then, Sarah's phone began to ring frantically. The name on the screen was Alex. He was probably calling desperately to apologize or to sort out the situation. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then long pressed the power button, turning her phone off. She didn't want any apologies or comfort right now. She wanted this time solely for herself and her mother. After the storm had passed, mother and daughter quietly absorbed the weight of the truth, holding each other close. Alex was in near panic. It was the worst situation he had ever experienced in his life. The woman he loved had left with a hurt expression, and her phone was off. His mother and sister sat frozen in their seats, looking utterly bewildered. In the precarious silence on the verge of collapsing, he had no idea what to do or how to do it. There was no conversation in the car on the way home either. His mother, Mrs. Chua, stared out the window, her lips tightly sealed. Her face was contorted with anger and humiliation. His sister Cheryl nervously bit her fingernails, showing signs of extreme agitation. What on earth happened? It's unbelievable. She said she was a high school graduate, but how did she know French and Mandarin Chinese 12? At her mumbling, Mrs. Chua snapped. Stop it. I don't want to hear it. Her sharp voice was mixed with stubbornness, unwilling to admit her mistake and an uncontrollable anxiety. For a woman who had lived her entire life feeling intellectually superior, what she had experienced today was not merely humiliation. It was a profound shock that shook her identity to its very core. As soon as they arrived home, Alex made his mother and sister sit on the living room sofa. Mom, Cheryl, why did you do that? This is clearly our fault. We need to go to Sarah's mother right now and apologize on our knees. At Alex's agitated voice, Mrs. Chua abruptly turned her head. There was no sign of remorse in her eyes. Instead, there was a defiant attitude, as if she intended to shift all blame to Madame Tan. Apologize, why should we? She was the one who deceived us. She said she was a high school graduate, but she was secretly learning foreign languages and manipulating us. This was an intentional insult, Mum. How is that deception? Madame Tan simply answered truthfully about her educational background. Is she obligated to reveal all her talents? If she had disclosed who she was from the beginning, we would have shown her proper respect, wouldn't we? She deliberately came to test us and humiliate us. She's a truly malicious woman. Alex was dumbfounded, speechless. His mother's logic was utterly self-centered and selfish. Their rudeness was due to Madame Tan's undisclosed identity, and all responsibility lay with Madame Tan for deceiving them. Cheryl chimed in. Yes, Mum's right. Something feels off. She didn't even properly disclose her profession. Could she be a con artist? She might have hidden her identity to get close to our family. Alex, you've been charmed by that woman. Cheryl, please stop. How can you say such things? Alex shouted, but the two women were unyielding. Instead of admitting their mistakes, they chose to suspect and distort Madame Tan's character to protect their shattered pride. Truth was not important to them. What mattered was their belief that they were not wrong, the illusion that their world remained solid. Just then, the front door opened, and the heavy sound of footsteps echoed. It was a figure who had never appeared in the family's conversations until now, Mr. David Chua, Alex's father, and the real power behind the family corporation. He had always excused himself from family dinners due to his busy schedule. With a dignified presence, Mr. David Chua immediately sensed the icy atmosphere in the living room. Untying his tie, he asked casually, "Did the dinner go well? Why is the atmosphere like this?" At his question, Mrs. Chua and Cheryl eagerly vied to recount the day's events. Of course, they conveniently omitted their own rudeness, exaggerating only how cleverly Madame Tan had deceived and humiliated them. Mr. David Chua listened to his wife and daughter in silence. There was no change in his expression. When their story concluded, he leaned back into the sofa and quietly asked, "So what did she say her profession was, Mrs.?" Chua hesitated for a moment before answering. She didn't disclose it properly. Just some negotiator. With what organization? Just Ministry of Foreign Affairs, she said. At that moment, Mr. David Chua's face subtly tightened. He took out his tablet PC from his briefcase and quickly began to search for something. His fingers scrolled across the screen a few times, then stopped at the profile picture of one individual. He looked between the tablet screen and his wife's face. Is this the woman? Mrs. Chua, Cheryl, and Alex all leaned in to look at the screen. On the screen was a picture of Madame Tan Mei-ling, neatly dressed in a formal suit. Below it was her official title, Republic of Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Principal Negotiating Representative for International Economic Dispute Resolution, Madame Tan Mei-ling. A collective gasp escaped Mrs. Chua's and Cheryl's lips. The woman they had dismissed as a mere high school graduate was no ordinary negotiator. She was a key figure who represented the nation fighting for crucial economic interests on the international stage. Mr. David Chua's face grew cold. He roughly slammed the tablet onto the table. "What on earth have you two done?" His voice was low with fury. But that anger was not empathy for the humiliation his wife and daughter had suffered. It was closer to the fear of a man foreseeing a massive disaster for his business. Do you know what kind of work this woman does? She is the person in charge of the new trade agreement between Singapore and the European Union. Whether our company's main export products get hit with massive tariffs depends entirely on this woman. At Mr. David Chua's outburst, the air in the house completely froze. Mrs. Chua and Cheryl only then began to vaguely grasp the gravity of their actions. They had not merely insulted the mother of their prospective daughter-in-law. They had directly provoked someone who held their family's fate in her hands. The essence of the situation had now shifted from an emotional issue to a matter of survival. Mr. David Chua abruptly stood up. As soon as the sun rises tomorrow morning, go find that woman. Whether you grovel on your knees or beg until your hands and feet turn raw, somehow get her forgiveness. This is a matter of life and death for our company, understand. In his eyes, only calculations of business profit and loss glittered. His wife's shattered pride or his son's wounded love held no importance for him. The seemingly solid equilibrium of the Chua family instantly began to waver, and a new kind of fissure entirely different from before started to appear between them. It was a catastrophe born of arrogance. The next morning, a black luxury sedan pulled up in front of the modest HDB flat where Sarah and Madame Tan lived. 13, 15, 17, 18, 20. Out of the car stepped Mrs. Chua and Cheryl. Unlike their elaborate attire from the previous day, they were dressed in the most subdued and humble-looking clothes possible. However, this awkward attempt at modesty only served to highlight their hypocritical intentions. They carried dozens of luxury shopping bags, a premium hamper of delicacies, and expensive fruit baskets in both arms. It was less an expression of apology and more a calculated bribe, as if to say, "This should be enough, right?" Sarah opened the door at the sound of the doorbell. Her face hardened when she saw the two women standing there. "What brings you here?" Mrs. Chua forced a benevolent smile and extended the shopping bags. "Oh dear. No, Sarah. We made a terrible mistake yesterday. We came to sincerely apologize to your mother. Her attitude had done a complete 180 overnight. Yesterday's arrogance was gone, replaced by a subservience that bordered on obsequiousness. Yet in her eyes, a subtle glimmer of contempt for others still remained, stubbornly refusing to disappear. Madame Tan emerged from the living room. She showed no surprise at their sudden visit. Instead, she greeted them with a calm expression as if she had anticipated everything. "Please come in. What brings you to such a humble place?" At Madame Tan's words, Mrs. Chua and Cheryl hastily entered the living room. They seemed momentarily flustered by the modest, almost sparse decor of the flat. The image of a high-ranking MFA official they held in their minds was so vastly different from the reality before their eyes. They quickly decided that even this modesty was a clever disguise, a sophisticated ploy to deceive them. "Madame Tan, we have committed an unforgivable sin." Mrs. Chua even went so far as to kneel on the living room floor. Cheryl reluctantly sat beside her. "We misjudged you completely. We didn't realize what a remarkable person you are, Madame Tan, and in our limited perception, we committed a grave discourtesy. Please, in your generosity, forgive us." Her apology was fluent, but it lacked sincerity. Only urgency and calculation aimed at averting the crisis, threatening their business, glittered in her eyes. Madame Tan was a person who had spent her life at countless negotiation tables, seeing through all kinds of lies and hypocrisy. In her eyes, Mrs. Chua's performance was transparent and childish. Madame Tan did not even glance at the gifts they had brought. She quietly poured out some tea. "Please sit down and have some tea first." Mrs. Chua and Cheryl reluctantly rose. Madame Tan sat on the sofa opposite them and quietly began to speak. "I know very well the real reason you two have come to see me today." At Madame Tan's calm voice, the two women's faces instantly stiffened. "Yesterday you insulted me because you were concerned about my high school education, and today you are kneeling because you need my profession. Isn't that right, Mrs.?" Chua's face turned red and pale as she was hit squarely with the truth. "No, Madame Tan. It's a misunderstanding. We are truly, Madame Tan." Cut her off. Her voice was still soft, but it held an iron-hard resolve. "If you were truly sincere, you would have apologized then and there yesterday. How can you call it sincerity when you come only after searching my profession and calculating its impact on your husband's business? This is not an apology. It is merely another form of business proposition." Madame Tan's words were like a sharp knife dissecting their hypocrisy without mercy. Mrs. Chua and Cheryl could offer no retort. In front of Madame Tan, who had seen right through their innermost thoughts, no excuse would work. Madame Tan rose from her seat. "I cannot accept your apology. You are not apologizing to me, Tan Mei Ling the person. You are merely bowing your heads to my title as an MFA negotiating representative. If I were to lose this job today and return to being an ordinary high school graduate lady, you would surely wear the same faces as yesterday, wouldn't you?" She opened the front door. It was a silent signal for them to leave. "And please take these gifts back with you. I have no intention of engaging in this kind of transaction. My daughter's marriage is not collateral to guarantee the safety of your business." Mrs. Chua and Cheryl rose unsteadily, like boxers who had just taken a knockout punch. Their faces were a mix of shame, embarrassment, and anger at their plan's failure. They rushed out of the flat, forgetting to even collect the gifts they had brought as if fleeing. As the door closed, Sarah looked at her mother with a complex expression. "Mom, is it okay to send them away like that? What if they try to harm us?" Madame Tan gently stroked her daughter's hair. "Sarah, stooping when you don't need to is cowardice, and failing to protect what you cherish is weakness. I only wanted to protect you. I didn't want my life to be dictated by their calculations." In that moment, Sarah understood. Her mother's refusal was not just about revenge or pride. It was a noble declaration that she would not sell her human dignity in the face of money and power, and a strong maternal instinct to protect her daughter's future. Meanwhile, in the empty car, Mrs. Chua angrily called her husband Mr. David Chua. "Darling, that woman wouldn't accept our apology. She's utterly unreasonable. She insulted us and drove us out. Do something, please, over the phone, mister." David Chua's cold voice responded. "Fools, you can't even handle one simple task. From now on, I'll take matters into my own hands. If talking nicely doesn't work, we'll have to use other methods." As the call ended, a wicked smile spread across Mrs. Chua's face, accompanied by a sense of relief. The ball was now in her husband's court. He was a man who believed there was nothing money and power couldn't achieve. She had no doubt that a stubborn woman like Madame Tan would soon succumb once she fell into his hands. The battle was entering a new phase. Mr. David Chua was not one to wait. He was always a man of action, and he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Upon receiving reports that his wife and daughter had been insulted and driven away by Madame Tan Mei Ling, he immediately set out to solve the problem in his own way. His approach always consisted of two steps. The first was to identify the opponent's weakness, and the second was to relentlessly exploit that weakness to break them down. He began collecting all available information about Madame Tan through his corporate secretariat, her background, family relationships, past activities, financial status, and reputation. Within a few days, a detailed report on Madame Tan landed on his desk. The report's contents were astonishingly clean. There were no common flaws typically found in high-ranking public officials, such as tax evasion, real estate speculation, or illicit solicitations. Her private life was equally impeccable. She had raised her daughter admirably as a single mother, and her reputation among her peers was one of integrity and incorruptibility. An interesting woman, Mr. David Chua, muttered, his lips curling into a slight smile. The cleaner the opponent, the stronger his desire to conquer. He fixed his gaze on the family relationships section on the last page of the report. Daughter Sarah Lim, currently an investigative journalist for an online news outlet. Mr. David Chua's eyes gleamed. Even the most perfect fortress can have a small crack. If he couldn't attack Madame Tan herself, he could shake the person she cherished most, her daughter. That would be the most effective and certain method. He immediately called several high-ranking media executives within his sphere of influence. The purpose of his calls was simple: to inquire about Sarah Lim, her usual reporting focus, and how to manage her. A few days later, strange things began to happen to Sarah. A scoop she had painstakingly investigated for a long time involving a large corporation's slush fund was rejected by her editor without any explanation. The editor-in-chief only repeated vague statements about the timing not being right and avoided Sarah's questions. Sarah was furious, but had no choice but to abide by the company's decision. However, a few days later, an almost identical article to what Sarah had investigated was sensationally published by a rival media outlet. It was as if someone had stolen Sarah's entire investigation and handed it over. Sarah rushed to her editor-in-chief, protesting vehemently, but all she got was an irresponsible answer. "There's nothing new under the Sunday, it's just a coincidence." That was just the beginning. Every investigative site Sarah visited encountered intentional interference, and hard-won interviews were repeatedly canceled just before the scheduled time. Rumors began to circulate among colleagues that Sarah had fallen out of favor with senior management. She was quickly isolated within the company. Sarah instinctively knew that this was not merely bad luck or coincidence. She was gripped by an ominous feeling that an unseen, powerful hand was slowly tightening around her neck. It wasn't hard to guess that Mr. David Chua was behind it all. Suffering from extreme stress and pressure, Sarah finally confided everything to her mother. As Madame Tan listened, her face grew cold. She immediately understood that the despicable pressure being exerted on her daughter was Mr. David Chua's scheme to make her submit. "He's doing this to you because of me." Madame Tan's voice trembled slightly. She could endure any attack directed at herself, but she could not bear her daughter's suffering. A burning anger surged within her. "Mom, I'll try to endure it somehow. We must never give in to people like that." Sarah in turn tried to comfort her mother. But Madame Tan knew a man like Mr. David Chua would never stop until he achieved his goal. His pressure would only become more cunning and persistent. She could not allow her daughter's life to be ruined like this. Madame Tan made up her mind. She could no longer remain on the defensive. It was time to counterattack. She began to investigate Mr. David Chua. Her network of information and connections built over years of working in the MFA was beyond imagination. She moved quietly, without revealing her identity. During her investigation, Madame Tan stumbled upon an intriguing piece of information about Mr. David Chua's wife, Mrs. Serene Chua, a story about her master's thesis from her university days. The information came through an elderly scholar who had been a close friend of Mrs. Chua's late thesis advisor. Mrs. Chua. Ah, I remember her. She was a very ambitious student, but there was always something fishy about her master's thesis. The elderly scholar delved into his old memories and continued the story. Back then, it was hard to get foreign materials, but she submitted a very rare French scholar's thesis as a reference. The problem was that the content of that French scholar's thesis and Mrs. Chua's thesis were almost identical, like a carbon copy. She cleverly changed a few sentences and didn't even cite it properly. It was blatant plagiarism. Then was that fact ever exposed? No, that French scholar was quite obscure, and the thesis itself was almost unknown here in Singapore. The advisor just quietly overlooked it, thinking it was better to be on good terms. There were also rumors that her family donated quite a bit of money to the university at the time, so it was all quietly buried. I bet that thesis is still proudly displayed somewhere in the university library even now. Madame Tan's eyes sharpened as she listened. Mrs. Chua, who had lived her entire life, pretending to be an embodiment of intellect and refinement. The woman full of pride in her profession as a former English teacher. The possibility that her dazzling career and status were in fact built on stolen knowledge. Madame Tan felt her heart pound. This was not just a counterattack card. It was the most powerful and deadly weapon capable of shattering Mrs. Chua's identity and pride in an instant. The game was being reset. While Mr. David Chua cast a dark shadow by pressuring Sarah, Madame Tan began to shine a light on Mrs. Chua's deepest, darkest secret. The prelude to an unseen war had begun. Alex was enduring hellish days. His contact with Sarah was completely cut off, and the atmosphere at home was as cold as an ice rink. His father constantly talked to someone plotting ways to force Sarah's mother to submit, and his mother and sister routinely hurled curses that bordered on maledictions. That woman is truly stubborn. Our Mr. Chua went so far and she didn't even bat an eyelid. She's no ordinary opponent. Exactly. She doesn't even care if her daughter's future is ruined. She's utterly heartless. Alex felt nauseous every time he heard their conversations. They deliberately ignored the fact that the root cause of this entire situation was their own arrogance and rudeness. He felt he could no longer live as part of this hypocritical family. He wanted to know more about Madame Tan Mei Ling, Sarah's mother. He wanted to understand why she had so firmly rejected their apology. and what she was fighting to protect. He believed it was the only way to win back Sarah's heart. Alex began searching for information about Madame Tan online, just as his father had done. The MFA website Past Media interviews documents from international forums she had participated in. The more he searched, the more he realized what an extraordinary person Madame Tan was. She always stood on the side of the underdog nations fighting against the tyranny of powerful countries. She spent countless nights negotiating to rectify unfair trade agreements and to dismantle unjust tariff barriers. Her name was always preceded by epithets like principled and unyielding negotiator. She was not a person swayed by money or power. She was a person who acted solely on her own convictions, national interest, and justice. Then Alex discovered an intriguing fact: the trade agreement with the European Union that Madame Tan Mei-ling was currently overseeing. One of the key contentious issues in that negotiation was a clause related to environmental regulations. The European Union was insisting on imposing high carbon border taxes on products from companies that excessively discharged harmful substances, and the Singaporean negotiating team was trying to ease those standards to minimize damage to local companies. Alex's heart sank. His father, Mr. David Chua's company, was at the very top of that list of companies, excessively discharging harmful substances. David Chua's company had been generating enormous profits by using cheap chemical raw materials and skimping on investments in wastewater treatment facilities. If this agreement passed as the European Union wished, the company's main export products would be hit with massive tariffs, and the blow would threaten the company's very existence. Now everything became clear. The reason his father was so obsessed with Madame Tan was not simply because of his wounded pride. It was a critical business issue, a matter of life and death for the company. His father was trying to pressure Madame Tan to achieve a favorable outcome at the negotiating table. Sarah's marriage was merely the most effective means to achieve that end. Alex felt all strength drained from his body. He felt a deep despair and betrayal at the realization that even his feelings, which he believed to be love, were being used as a tool for his father's business. He decided he had to meet Sarah. He had to tell her all of this and beg for her forgiveness. Perhaps this would be his last chance. He had to tell her that he would no longer live as his father's puppet, and that he would stand by Sarah's side and fight with her. Alex went directly to Sarah's company. After waiting for hours in the company lobby, he finally encountered Sarah as she was leaving for the day. Sarah's face had grown visibly thinner. Seeing Alex, she coldly turned away and tried to pass him. "Sarah, please wait a moment. Please, just 5 minutes, let me explain." Alex blocked her path, pleading. Seeing his desperate expression, Sarah reluctantly stopped. They moved to a quiet cafe near the office. Alex, his voice trembling, confessed everything he had discovered. The situation his father's company was in, the truth hidden behind the trade agreement, and the real reason his father was pressuring Sarah and her mother. Throughout his confession, Sarah's expression remained stern. But by the time Alex finished, her eyes were no longer filled with anger and contempt, but with deep pity and confusion. She began to think that Alex, too, might be another victim of this grand tragedy. "So, what are you going to do now?" Sarah asked. Alex answered without hesitation. "I'm going to stop my father. I won't let him bother you and your mother anymore. I'll stand by your side. Please just trust me one more time." Sincerity shone in Alex's eyes. Sarah was conflicted. Could she trust him again? But one thing was clear. Alex's confession had begun to change the tide of this battle. Cracks had appeared within the enemy's ranks, and pieces of the hidden truth were slowly revealing themselves. Now was the time to piece those fragments together and complete the larger picture. Madame Tan sat at her desk, opening an old photo album. Tucked within the album was a black and white photograph carefully preserved. It showed a young girl with an innocent face, happily smiling, embracing a stack of books. It was a picture of her own childhood. The background of the photo was a dilapidated hut that looked like it could collapse at any moment, and the girl's clothes were patched and worn in many places. Yet the girl's eyes shone brighter than anything in the world. She gazed silently at the photograph drifting into the distant past. A poor mountain village not long after the war. Madame Tan was born there, the fourth of 7 children. Extreme poverty was an everyday reality. 3 meals a day were a luxury, and rice was a rare sight seen only a few times a year. But for Madame Tan, there was something harder to bear than poverty: her thirst for knowledge. There was no school in the village. All the children had to walk miles over the mountain to attend primary school in the town. But Madame Tan's parents couldn't afford to send even their daughters to school. They believed that a girl's best life was to help with household chores, marry quickly, and have sons. Young Madame Tan secretly learned to read by peeking over her older brother's shoulders at their worn textbook. At night, by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, she would melt pencil leads with her saliva to practice writing on rough paper. To her, the world was a vast book full of endless curiosities. Why was the sky blue? Why did the seasons change? What kind of world lay beyond those mountains? The first to recognize Madame Tan's extraordinary talent was her maternal uncle, who ran a small eatery in the town market. When he occasionally visited Madame Tan's home, her uncle was astonished to see his young niece effortlessly reading difficult Chinese characters written on newspaper. This child is no ordinary child. It's a waste to leave such talent in this mountain village. I must take her and send her to school. Thanks to her uncle's stubborn insistence, Madame Tan first set foot in a school at the age of 10. Even though she started late, she absorbed everything like a sponge soaking up water. Her grades were always first in her class, and she swept various academic competitions, earning her the title of Mountain Genius. But hardship came too early. Around the time Madame Tan was about to enter secondary school, her father was severely injured while gathering firewood in the mountains and became bedridden. With the pillar of the household gone, the family's fortunes quickly declined. Her older brothers all left for the city factories to earn money, and the responsibility of caring for her younger siblings and nursing her sick father fell entirely on Madame Tan and her mother. She eventually had to drop out of school. Her uncle shed tears of regret, but there was nothing they could do. The young girl's dream of becoming a diplomat and experiencing the wider world seemed to be buried in ashes. But Madame Tan did not give up. She worked in the fields during the day and spent her nights at the town library, devouring every book she could find. What particularly captivated her were foreign languages. English, French, Mandarin, Chinese, Malay. She learned multiple languages on her own through old dictionaries and books. 12 languages were her only window to the wider world beyond her confined reality. Years passed. Her siblings were all settled, and her parents had passed away, leaving Madame Tan with time solely for herself. But she was already well past the prime age for marriage, just a high school graduate, an old maid from the countryside. Everyone around her told her to give up and just get married, but a small, unextinguished flame still burned in her heart. I cannot end my life like this. She used all her savings to move into a small, humble room in a rented shophouse in Singapore. And she embarked on the challenge that everyone called impossible, the Foreign Service Officer exam. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. She cut back on sleep, dedicating herself to her studies, and ate simple meals like kaya toast and half-boiled eggs to save time. 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. Sometimes she wanted to give up everything in despair, but each time she remembered her younger self who had never lost hope even amidst the ashes. Finally, on the day the results were announced, tears streamed down Madame Tan's face as she checked her candidate number. After decades of detours, she had finally reached the starting line of her dream. Life after that was like a war. What awaited her at the MFA was the stigma of being a special hire due to her high school education and invisible discrimination. Her colleagues were all elites, graduates of prestigious universities with overseas education. To survive among them, Madame Tan had to work twice, even thrice as hard as others. Even through a painful separation from the man she loved and raising her daughter Sarah alone, she never gave up on her career. Instead, she used the trials she faced as opportunities to become even stronger. She led peace negotiations in war-torn regions of Africa, facing threats to her life, and fought relentlessly to protect Singapore's interests, even under pressure from powerful nations. Her sincerity and competence eventually won over her colleagues, who had initially viewed her with prejudice. Madame Tan, the negotiator, became one of the most trusted figures within the MFA. Closing the album, Madame Tan smiled faintly. Her life had been like a drama. Like a flower blooming from the ashes, she had never lost hope amidst desperate circumstances, carving out her own destiny through her own strength. And now she was facing the most important negotiation of her life, protecting her daughter Sarah's life and happiness. Against the formidable barrier of Mr. David Chua, she was once again ready to stake everything and fight. Her past years were her most powerful weapon. Sarah did not overlook the clue Alex had given her: the suspicion of plagiarism in Mrs. Serene Chua's master's thesis. If it were true, it could be the decisive blow that would completely turn the tide of this war. As a journalist, she mobilized all her resources and contacts to unearth the truth. The first task was to obtain the problematic thesis. Sarah visited the library of the university Mrs. Chua had graduated from. Deep within the old archives, she finally found Mrs. Chua's master's thesis covered in a thick layer of dust. A study of the transformation of women in Anglo-American symbolist poetry. Even the title reeked of intellectual vanity. Sarah meticulously photocopied the thesis. Next, she needed the original, the thesis, by the French scholar that Mrs. Chua was suspected of plagiarizing. With the help of the elderly scholar, Madame Tan's former colleague Sarah was able to receive the rare original thesis file via email. Now, all that remained was to compare and analyze the two theses. Sarah asked a university friend who was fluent in French to translate and analyze it. A few days later, her friend called, her voice filled with excitement. "Sarah, this is huge. It's not just plagiarism. It's practically copy-pasting." From the problem statement in the introduction to the summary in the conclusion, the overall structure and core arguments of the two theses are identical. There are countless similar parts, even in sentence structure and metaphors used. This is undeniable plagiarism. Sarah felt her heart pound. The physical evidence was secured, but this alone was not enough. If Mrs. Chua claimed it was merely a coincidence, a legal battle would only drag on. She needed more conclusive evidence, a smoking gun that would prove Mrs. Chua had intentionally plagiarized. Sarah revisited the elderly scholar for advice. The scholar pondered for a moment before offering a possibility. Everyone wondered how Mrs. Chua managed to obtain that French thesis back then. It wasn't an era where the internet was developed as it is now. It's highly likely she asked someone in France to procure the materials. Perhaps you could try tracing that. Sarah immediately began digging into Mrs. Chua's past. Her university friends, former teaching colleagues, even members of her church. After persistent inquiries, Sarah finally obtained crucial testimony. It came from a middle-aged woman who claimed to have been Mrs. Chua's closest friend during university. She was initially reluctant to speak, but eventually opened up after Sarah's persistent persuasion and sincere appeal. Serene, she was always very ambitious, even back then. Her dream was to become a professor no matter what. She was under immense stress because of her master's thesis. She didn't have the confidence to write a good thesis on her own, so she asked a senior male student who had gone to France for further studies. She asked him to find and send her the latest theses similar to her research topic. Do you know who that senior was, of course? Mr. Kevin Lee, a man Serene once had a crush on. It didn't work out between them in the end, but the thesis he sent her was that one. Serene was ecstatic when she received it. She said she was saved. She wasn't good at French, so she hired a translation freelancer to translate it entirely, then cunningly altered it to make it look like her own ideas. I saw it all. All the puzzle pieces fit. The name Kevin Lee. He was the key figure who knew the entire truth of this incident. Sarah tracked him down and found that he was currently living in France, running a small trading company. Sarah made an international call. Mr. Kevin Lee, initially cautious, let out a deep sigh when Sarah explained the full story. Serene. So she eventually sold my name for that, did she? Yes, it's true. I sent her that thesis. I sent it purely for academic reference, and I never dreamed she would plagiarize it entirely and pass it off as her own. When I confronted her about it later, she pleaded with me to overlook it, just this once, saying her entire future depended on it. In my youthful naivete, I just covered it up, but it has been a burden on my conscience ever since. Sarah politely asked if he would be willing to make a public statement. Mr. Kevin Lee hesitated for a moment, but then firmly replied, "Understood. I can no longer ignore a success built upon lies. I will testify to all the facts. If necessary, I will even look for the old letters Serene and I exchanged. There should be some corroborating evidence." A few days later, an international package arrived from Mr. Kevin Lee. Inside were a few old letters he had kept and a detailed statement outlining all the facts. In the letters, a passage written by Mrs. Chua clearly read, "Thanks to the thesis you sent me, Senior, I think I can successfully complete my thesis. I will never forget this kindness. Now all preparations were complete. Sarah compiled all the evidence into a single file: Mrs. Chua's thesis, the comparative analysis of the original French thesis, the recorded testimony of her friend and Miss Kevin Lee's statement, and copies of the letters. It was a powerful bomb, capable of instantly demolishing the fortress of intellect Mrs. Chua had spent her life building. Sarah quietly awaited the most opportune moment to detonate this bomb, waiting for the precise moment when Mrs. Chua's hypocrisy and arrogance reached their peak to turn her entire world into ashes in an instant. Mr. David Chua's pressure grew more intense by the day. Sarah was eventually forced to resign from her company. The official reason was downsizing due to worsening business conditions, but it was effectively a dismissal. She applied to other news outlets but was repeatedly rejected at the resume screening stage. It was clear Mr. David Chua had influenced the entire media industry. Meanwhile, Mr. David Chua's company was facing its own crisis. Rumors circulated that it was being investigated by financial authorities for stock manipulation, causing its share price to plummet daily. News that the trade agreement with the European Union was also leaning unfavorably towards Singapore exacerbated the situation, pushing the company into its biggest crisis since its founding. Mr. David Chua grew increasingly anxious. He was consumed by extreme fear that his company could collapse if Madame Tan did not accept his proposal. Losing his reason, he was now preparing for a final gamble. He used a private investigation agency to dig into Madame Tan's background. He kept her under constant surveillance, desperate to find even the slightest flaw. Then a few photos landed in his hands. They showed Madame Tan Mei Ling casually strolling and conversing with a middle-aged man on a weekend. Mr. David Chua smiled triumphantly. He had the man's identity investigated. The man's identity was soon revealed. He was a French diplomat currently dispatched to Singapore as a member of the European Union trade delegation. "This is it, mister," David Chua exclaimed, slapping his knee. He planned to use these photos to blackmail Madame Tan, Singapore's chief negotiator, inappropriate clandestine meetings with an opposing diplomat, a traitor selling out national interests. If such sensational headlines broke, Madame Tan's career would be over. Even if their relationship was purely platonic, the mere release of such photos during sensitive negotiations could be a fatal blow to her. He decided to use this as his final bargaining chip. Meanwhile, Madame Tan saw through Mr. David Chua's every move as if reading his palm. Through her intelligence network, she had already grasped that Mr. David Chua was digging into her background and intended to distort her meeting with her longtime friend, the French diplomat, to fabricate a scandal. Just as expected. A low and despicable tactic. Madame Tan remained completely unshaken. In fact, she even offered a faint smile at the thought that Mr. David Chua was digging his own grave. She had already anticipated this entire situation and prepared countermeasures. The French diplomat she had met was not just a friend. He was a colleague with whom Madame Tan had worked side by side facing life-and-death situations in African conflict zones, and he was a key witness holding all the evidence of Mr. David Chua's company's illegal environmental destruction in Africa. Madame Tan planned to turn all of this against him. The moment Mr. David Chua drew the sword of scandal, she was ready to plunge that very sword into his heart. A storm was brewing. Both sides held their trump cards, preparing for the final showdown. On the edge of a cliff with nowhere left to retreat, the ultimate gamble for their destinies was about to begin. Alex was steeped in deep helplessness amidst his father's obsessive ambition and the company's crisis. Since confessing everything to Sarah, he had been excluded from all company affairs by his father and was virtually under house arrest. He could not just stand by and watch everything descend into ruin. He secretly entered his father's study and began rummaging through the company's internal documents. While reviewing documents related to the trade agreement, he discovered a shocking fact. There was a hidden contract detailing his father's illegal lobbying involving huge sums of money targeting some hardline European Union Parliament members. His father had intended to bribe them to steer the negotiations in his favor. If exposed, this would not merely be a corporate scandal, but a massive incident that could escalate into an international diplomatic issue. Alex felt his hands tremble as he secretly photographed the contract. This was his last card to stop his father and end this dreadful battle. He decided to take this evidence to Sarah and her mother. It was an act of betraying his own family, but for the greater justice, it was a necessary choice. Now all preparations were complete. The blades of truth held in each of their hands gleamed coldly, awaiting the final confrontation. Mr. David Chua personally contacted Madame Tan for a final showdown. He summoned her to his chairman's office, his home ground. The intention was to psychologically overwhelm her in the most imposing and dominant space. Madame Tan accepted his invitation without hesitation. She was not alone. Her daughter Sarah, who had decided to bear all the truth with her, accompanied her. The massive wooden doors of the chairman's office opened, and Madame Tan and Sarah stepped inside. Not only Mr. David Chua, but also Mrs. Chua and Cheryl were seated there. They greeted the two women with arrogant, confident expressions, anticipating victory like judges looking down upon condemned prisoners. "Welcome, Madame Tan Mei Ling. I requested this meeting directly to stop wasting time and end this tiresome battle." Mr. David Chua leaned back in his imposing executive chair and began. His voice oozed the complacency of a victor. "My proposal is simple. In the ongoing trade agreement, remove the environmental regulations clause that is unfavorable to our company, or at least defer it for 3 years or more. If you do that, I will clear all obstacles blocking your daughter's path. I will ensure her honorable reinstatement as a journalist, and I will spare no expense in supporting her to walk a path of success for the rest of her life. And I will gladly approve Alex's and Sarah's marriage. This is the best offer I can give you." It was not an offer. It was a blatant threat and coercion. Madame Tan listened to him quietly, then replied with a faint smile. "Mr. Chua, I am a public servant. My duty is to protect the national interests of Singapore, not to represent the private interests of a specific corporation. I cannot accept your proposal." At Madame Tan's firm refusal, Miss David Chua's face momentarily stiffened. "It seems you haven't grasped the situation yet. Very well. In that case, I have no choice but to pull out this card." Mr. David Chua threw a few photos onto the table. They showed Madame Tan with the French diplomat. "Do you know who this man is? He is a key figure in the European Union trade delegation. What do you think would happen if the world found out about such private meetings between representatives of negotiating nations? Your reputation and career would be ruined overnight. You would be branded a traitor who sold out national interests through an inappropriate relationship. Choose, accept my proposal and gain everything, or lose everything and fall into the abyss, Mrs. Chua's and Cheryl's faces were alight with schadenfreude. They believed this woman was finally finished. But Madame Tan's expression remained utterly serene. She glanced at the photos, then looked directly at Mr. David Chua. "Mr. Chua, you are greatly mistaken." At Madame Tan's calm voice, all eyes in the room focused on her. "The man in that photo is my longtime friend and colleague. And he is also a very important witness who has secured all the evidence regarding the numerous illegal activities your company has committed in Africa over the past decade." At Madame Tan's words, Mr. David Chua's face turned white. "What? What are you talking about? Your company established a factory in a small African country and in blatant disregard of local laws discharged toxic waste into rivers and soil. As a result, countless residents fell ill and died, and the environment was irreversibly destroyed. My friend working with local NGOs has investigated all these facts for years and is now ready to sue you, Mr. Chua, at the International Criminal Court for Environmental Crimes." Madame Tan took a stack of documents from her bag and placed them on the table. The documents contained photos of polluted rivers, medical certificates of sick children, and various data and testimonies proving Mr. David Chua's company's illegal activities. "You intend to blackmail me with these photos. Very well. The moment these photos are released to the media, I will expose your atrocities to the entire world. Who do you think the public will believe? A mere gossip-mongering scandal or an anti-human environmental crime that claimed countless lives? Which do you think is the graver sin?" The tables had turned once again. Mr. David Chua's trump card had become a knife aimed at his own heart. Cold sweat poured down his forehead. But it wasn't over yet. The real decisive blow was held in Sarah's hand. Sarah quietly stepped forward and fixed her gaze on Mrs. Chua, who had been staring at her mother, and Mrs. Serene Chua. "I also have something to say to you." Sarah turned on her tablet PC and placed it in the center of the table. The screen displayed Mrs. Chua's master's thesis and the original French scholar's thesis side by side. The plagiarized sections were clearly highlighted in red. Is this the reality of the intellectualism you have prided yourself on your entire life, madam? The false honor built on stolen knowledge. Mrs. Chua's face completely drained of color. She gasped, staring at the tablet screen. How did I? The truth always comes to light, madam. We also have the statement and letters from Mr. Kevin Lee, the senior who helped you plagiarize your thesis. If these facts are revealed to the media, you will live the rest of your life branded as a plagiarist, a fake intellectual. Mrs. Chua completely collapsed. She slumped onto the sofa speechless. Her pride and honor, which she had guarded her entire life, had turned to ashes in an instant. Just then, the chairman's office door burst open and Alex entered. A document envelope was in his hand. He looked at his father with a stern expression. Father, stop this now. He took out a copy of the illicit lobbying contract which proved his father's illegal lobbying of European Union Parliament members from the envelope and threw it onto the table. If this gets out, our company is truly finished. And you, father, will become an international criminal. I can no longer ignore your wrongdoing. Mr. David Chua was now speechless. All the weapons he had believed in were shattered, and he was betrayed even by his most trusted son. He had become a completely isolated island. His kingdom, built on arrogance and self-righteousness, was crumbling helplessly before the massive wave of truth. The final confrontation, where everything was at stake, was ending in the Chua family's complete defeat. A heavy silence lingered in the chairman's office. The Chua family, who moments ago had seemed to own the world, were now reduced to pathetic losers. Mr. David Chua stared blankly into space. His mind was utterly empty. The success he had spent his life building, his world where he believed he could control everything with money and power, had shattered into pieces. International legal action exposure of illegal lobbying, any one of these would spell the end of his life. He no longer held a single card to threaten or appease Madame Tan Mei Ling. Instead, she now held his lifeline. Mrs. Chua sat slumped on the sofa, looking bewildered. No sound reached her ears. Only Sarah's voice calling her a plagiarist, a fake intellectual, echoed in her mind. With the pillars of intellect and honor which she had relied on her entire life torn out from their roots, she felt lost, not knowing how to live on. She realized to her bitter core how foolish and pathetic her arrogance had been. Cheryl looked between her father, mother, and brother Alex as if unable to believe any of this. She had never imagined that the solid fortress she had believed in, the kingdom of the Chua family, would collapse so futilely. Her mind was filled only with the practical problems that lay ahead. If the company went bankrupt, all the wealth and honor she currently enjoyed would vanish. Everything that had sustained her life was on the verge of disappearing like a mirage. It was Madame Tan who put an end to all of this. She quietly rose from her seat. On her face, instead of triumph or the satisfaction of revenge, was a deep sense of pity and bitterness. I did not come here to ruin you. Madame Tan's voice pulled everyone in the room back to reality. I merely wish for you to take responsibility for the wrongs you have committed. Stop trying to cover up the truth with money and power, and try to live with at least a minimum of human conscience. Madame Tan looked at Mr. David Chua. Regarding the crimes committed in Africa, you should formally apologize to the local residents now and establish a substantial compensation fund for the victims, and change your company's management practices. The world is no longer a place where companies can survive by destroying the environment and exploiting workers for short-term gains. If you genuinely show remorse and make efforts to change, I will speak to my friend about temporarily postponing the international legal action. But remember, this is your last chance. And she turned her gaze to Mrs. Chua. Madam, I will not deliberately expose your plagiarism to the world, but act according to your own conscience. It is entirely your choice whether you voluntarily return the degree obtained through stolen knowledge and remain an adult who is not ashamed before the students you taught, or if you will live your entire life hiding behind false honor. Finally, she looked at Alex with warm eyes. Thank you for your courage, young man. It must have been a difficult decision, but you can walk a different path from your father. Madame Tan took Sarah's hand and left the chairman's office. There was no longer any reason to remain in that space. The judgment was over, and all that remained was for the losers to clean up their own mess. After Madame Tan and Sarah left, a long silence hung in the chairman's office. The first to speak was Alex. I'm leaving this house. His voice was resolute. I can no longer live watching my father's and mother's hypocrisy and greed. I will start a new life on my own terms, in my own way. Alex walked out of the chairman's office without looking back. Mr. David Chua and Mrs. Chua could not hold back their son's departing figure. Cheryl began to sob. What's going to happen to us now? It's all over. Her cries filled the empty chairman's office. The kingdom that once believed it had everything was collapsing so tragically. The fortress built on their individual desires and arrogance had ultimately become a prison for themselves. Now they would scatter, living out their lives, paying the price for the sins left to each of them. News of the Chua family's downfall spread quietly but quickly. Mr. David Chua eventually stepped down as chairman. He traveled to Africa, officially apologized to the local residents, and established a massive compensation fund for the victims. The company transitioned to a professional management system and launched an image overhaul, announcing large-scale investments in eco-friendly technologies. Whether he truly repented for his past wrongs or if it was merely a forced choice for survival, no one could tell. What was clear was that he had lost the absolute power he once wielded. Mrs. Chua ceased all external activities and became a recluse. No news of her voluntarily returning her degree was heard. However, the honor of being an intellectual, which she had painstakingly built her entire life, must have already crumbled miserably within her heart. She was now trapped in an eternal mental prison, forced to live the rest of her life reliving her lies and hypocrisy. Cheryl, as her father's company faced difficulties, found her English tuition center also plunged into serious financial trouble. Buried under debt from reckless business expansion, she eventually had to close the center. The woman who once adorned herself with flashy designer brands was now reduced to looking for re-employment in ordinary attire. Alex severed all ties with his family and became independent. He did not accept a single cent of his father's wealth. Instead, he joined a small startup company as an entry-level employee starting from scratch. Although he had nothing, his heart felt freer and calmer than ever. He no longer had to live under his father's shadow, relying on false wealth and prestige. What happened to Sarah? She rejected her former company's offer to reinstate her as a journalist. Instead, she established her own small independent news agency. She wanted to create a small but powerful media outlet that spoke only the truth without bowing to powerful capital and influence. Madame Tan silently supported her daughter's new endeavor. Time passed and wounds slowly healed. One weekend afternoon, Alex visited Sarah's small office. He was a little thinner than before, but much firmer and more mature. In his hand, instead of a flamboyant bouquet of flowers, was a modest but warm bag of curry puffs. 23, 27, long time no see, Sarah. How have you been? The two exchanged an awkward but warm greeting. They shared the curry puffs in silence for a while. It wasn't the lavish meal at an expensive restaurant like before, but it tasted warmer and more genuine than any banquet. I still haven't forgotten you, Alex finally said with difficulty. But I know I don't have the right to ask you to start over. I just came to see if you were doing well, and to tell you that I'm really proud of you. Sarah looked quietly at Alex. In his eyes, instead of his past weakness, there was sincerity and earnestness. She could feel how much he had struggled to overcome his wounds and transform into a new person. I thought of you sometimes too. A faint smile spread across Alex's face at Sarah's reply. It was uncertain if their relationship could return to the passionate romance they once shared. Perhaps they would remain good friends. But one thing was clear. Having overcome past hurts and pains, they had forged a much more mature relationship, one built on mutual respect and understanding as independent individuals. Madame Tan, quietly observing their meeting from outside the window, smiled faintly. She would no longer intervene in her daughter's life. Sarah was now strong enough to choose her own path, heal her own wounds, and create her own love. After all, the storms had passed, a peaceful, everyday life finally arrived. It was not a flawless peace devoid of scars. It was a true peace granted only to mature individuals who embraced the traces of their wounds and used them as stepping stones for a better tomorrow. Several years passed. Madame Tan honorably retired from the MFA after reaching her retirement age. Her retirement ceremony was attended by numerous local and international diplomats who offered heartfelt respect and praise to the legendary negotiator known as the Iron Butterfly. After retirement, she quietly dedicated herself to nurturing future generations, drawing from her vast experience. Leaving her illustrious past behind, she returned to the life of an ordinary mother, Madame Tan Mei Ling. Sarah's independent news agency grew into a small but influential media outlet. She was recognized as a talented journalist, winning several awards for her incisive investigative reports that shone a light on the dark corners of society. One sunny autumn afternoon, Madame Tan visited Sarah's home. Sarah had recently remarried Alex in a simple ceremony and was building their newlywed life in a small rented flat. 13, 15, 17, 18, 20, Mum, come in, Sarah greeted, her mother with a radiant smile. Beside her stood Alex wearing an apron. The image of the wealthy young heir was gone, replaced by a man awkwardly but earnestly preparing dinner. Welcome, Madame Tan, dinner will be ready soon. The three of them laughed at Alex's good-natured banter. On the dining table, instead of exotic delicacies, there was only simple home-cooked chicken curry, stir-fried vegetables, and a few modest side dishes. 21, 28. But it was a warmer and happier meal than any banquet at an engagement dinner. The three conversed pleasantly while they ate. There were no heavy discussions about politics or economics. Their talk was about ordinary small things, how much the prices at the market had risen today, whether the newly released movie was good, or how cute the neighbor's dog was. After dinner, they sat in the living room peeling fruit. Outside the window, the red sunset beautifully painted the sky. Mum, do you remember that engagement dinner? Sarah suddenly brought up the past. Madame Tan quietly nodded. If you hadn't stepped in so wonderfully that day, what would have become of us? Madame Tan put down her fruit knife and warmly took her daughter's and son-in-law's hands. Sarah, Alex, true victory in life isn't about crushing others to rise above them. It's about not losing yourself, protecting the people precious to you, and fully enjoying the happiness of an ordinary day just like today. That is the greatest victory. At her words, Sarah and Alex looked at each other and smiled. They could now fully understand the meaning of those words. Only after enduring countless storms and trials did they finally realize how precious and magnificent an ordinary life truly was. Madame Tan looked at the sunset outside the window. Her life had certainly not been easy. Like a flower that blossomed from the ashes, she had used countless hurts and tears as nutrients to become the person she was today. But she had never once regretted her life. Now by her side were her loving daughter and a son-in-law as dependable as a son. Their laughter would fill the rest of her life, her greatest happiness and reward. The wounds of the past remained as faint scars, but they no longer hurt. They were instead proud badges of honor, proving how much hardship they had overcome together. As the sun completely set, warm lights came on in the living room. The happy laughter of the three filled the house. The time filled with revenge and hatred had passed. Now new days awaited them, filled with love, understanding, and the preciousness of ordinary life. That was indeed the most perfect and dazzling happy ending they had achieved together.